First exploration. What happens to a mind that knows too much to have faith anymore? There's a story they don't tell you in philosophy class. It's about a man who spent his entire life building a cathedral out of logic. Stone by stone, argument by argument, proof by proof, only to realize at the very end that he'd been standing inside it the whole time. And the moment he saw that, he stopped writing. Forever. His name was Thomas Aquinas, a mountain of a man, they said, not just in body, though he was large, slow-moving, often mistaken for simple, but in the sheer weight of what he carried in his mind. He was the kind of person who could hold 1,000 contradictions at once and somehow make them sing in harmony. For decades, he wrote, he reasoned. He tried to prove God the way you'd prove a theorem, and for a while, it seemed to work. But then, something happened. It was December 6th, 1273. He was celebrating Mass in a small chapel, the kind of place where the light comes in dusty and golden through narrow windows. And in the middle of the service, surrounded by ritual he'd performed 1,000 times, something broke open inside him, or maybe something closed. No one really knows. What we do know is that afterward, he refused to write another word. His students begged him. His brothers in the monastery pleaded with him to finish his greatest work, the Summa Theologica, his massive, towering attempt to reconcile everything, reason and faith, Aristotle and Scripture, the mind of man and the mind of God. He looked at them and said, "I cannot. Everything I have written seems to me like straw." Straw, all those years, all those arguments, all that brilliance, straw. Imagine spending your whole life trying to translate the infinite into sentences, trying to catch lightning in a jar made of grammar, and then one day you see the lightning itself, unfiltered, unmediated, so vast and so simple that every word you've ever written feels like a child's drawing of the sun. What do you do then? How do you go back to the drawing? Aquinas didn't. He lived only a few more months after that. And in those months, he was quieter than he'd ever been. Not sad exactly, not broken, just finished. As if he'd been trying to solve a riddle his whole life, and the answer turned out to be that there was no riddle at all, just presence, just being. But here's the thing that haunts me about his story. It's not that he lost his faith. It's that his faith outgrew his mind. And for a man whose mind was his cathedral, his fortress, his identity, that must have felt like death. The good kind, maybe. The kind that makes room for something bigger, but death nonetheless. We live in a world that worships answers. We're told that intelligence is the highest virtue, that if you can just think hard enough, read enough, reason enough, you'll arrive at truth. And maybe you will. Maybe you'll build your own cathedral of understanding. But what Aquinas discovered, what I think he was trying to tell us in his silence, is that there's a kind of knowing that can only happen when you stop trying to know, when you let the mind rest, when you stop translating experience into explanation, and just let it be. He spent his life trying to reason with God, trying to build a ladder of logic tall enough to reach the divine. And in the end, God didn't meet him at the top of the ladder. God was standing at the bottom the whole time, waiting for him to climb back down. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from thinking too much. Not the exhaustion of the body, but the exhaustion of the soul. It's the weariness of trying to hold everything together with your mind, as if your understanding is the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Aquinas knew that weariness. He lived in it for decades, and when he finally let go, when he finally admitted that his words were straw, I think he found something better than answers. He found rest. Not the rest of giving up, but the rest of arrival, the rest of a man who's been rowing upstream his whole life, and finally realizes the current was carrying him all along. So what happens to a mind that knows too much to have faith anymore? Maybe it doesn't lose faith. Maybe it just stops confusing faith with certainty, stops confusing God with an argument, stops confusing the cathedral with the light that fills it. And maybe, in that stopping, in that sacred exhaustion, it finds the very thing it was looking for all along. Not a truth that can be spoken, but a truth that can only be lived, quietly, in the space between words, in the silence after the Mass, in the moment when you finally stop trying to explain the light and just let it warm your face. Aquinas tried to reason with God, and in the end, God answered him, not with an argument, but with a presence so complete that every argument became unnecessary, every word, straw, every thought, a whisper in the wind. And in that wind, there was finally, peace. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. Second exploration. Can you prove something exists that you've never seen with your own eyes? There's a particular kind of loneliness in trying to convince someone of something you can't quite touch. Aquinas knew this loneliness intimately. He spent years, decades really, trying to demonstrate the existence of God using only the tools of logic. No miracles, no visions, no burning bushes or voices from the sky, just reason. Pure, cold, beautiful reason. It seems almost absurd when you say it out loud, proving God. As if the infinite could be cornered by a syllogism. As if the ground of all being could be trapped in a conclusion. But that was the project. That was the mountain he chose to climb. He wasn't naive about it. Aquinas understood the problem better than most. He knew you couldn't see God directly, not with these eyes, not in this life. But he believed, had to believe, that you could see the traces, the fingerprints, the way a detective finds evidence of a presence that's already left the room. Motion implies a mover. Design implies a designer. Existence implies something that holds it all together, something that doesn't need anything else to be. He called them the 5 ways, 5 arguments, 5 paths up the same mountain. And for centuries, people have been walking those paths, some finding their way to the summit, others getting lost in the fog halfway up, still others deciding the mountain was never there at all. But here's what strikes me about the whole endeavor, what keeps me awake some nights, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone. Aquinas spent all that time proving God's existence to other people, building those careful arguments like a mason builds a wall, brick by logical brick. But he already believed. He didn't need the proofs for himself. He was a monk, a priest, a man who woke up every morning and prayed to the very thing he was trying to prove existed. So who were the proofs really for? The skeptics? The doubters? Or was it something else? Was it the work itself that mattered? The act of trying to build a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between the knowable and the mystery? As if by building that bridge carefully enough, thoroughly enough, he could somehow make the gap smaller, make the leap less terrifying. I think about this whenever I'm trying to explain something I know deeply but can't quite show. Love, maybe, or beauty, or the feeling you get when you're alone in the woods and everything goes quiet, and you sense, you don't see, you don't hear, but you sense that you're not alone at all, that you're being held by something vast and patient and older than trees. You can't prove that. You can point to it. You can say, look at how the light falls there. Listen to the way the wind moves. Feel how still you've become. But you can't make someone feel it if they don't. You can't argue them into awe. Aquinas knew this too, I think. He knew that all his proofs, all his careful reasoning, all his dialectical precision, none of it could give someone the experience itself. The proofs were like a map, and a map, no matter how detailed, is not the territory. It's just paper with lines on it. Useful, maybe. Beautiful even, but not the thing itself. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but true in the way stories can be true even when the facts aren't quite right. Someone once asked him, after he'd finished one of his great works, whether he'd finally proven God's existence beyond all doubt. And he's said to have replied, "I have proven that God must exist, but I have not proven that he does." That distinction, that razor-thin difference between logical necessity and actual presence, between the God who must be and the God who is, between the conclusion of an argument and the weight of a hand on your shoulder in the dark. That's the gap Aquinas lived in, the space between knowing about something and knowing it, between the description and the encounter, between the word fire and the heat on your skin. And maybe that's why he stopped writing in the end. Maybe that's why, after his experience in that chapel, he couldn't bring himself to add another word to his volumes of careful proofs, because he'd finally crossed the gap. He'd finally moved from knowing about God to knowing God. And once you've tasted the real thing, the map stops mattering. You can't prove something exists that you've never seen with your own eyes. Not really. Not in the way that changes anything. But you can bear witness to its effects. You can point to the patterns, the order, the strange, persistent longing in the human heart for something more, something beyond, something that holds us even when we don't know we're being held. Aquinas spent his life building those proofs, and they're beautiful in their way, intricate and elegant and surprisingly gentle for something built out of logic. They're like Gothic arches in a cathedral, soaring, precise, holding up something much heavier than they look like they should be able to hold. But in the end, they're still just the architecture, the building itself. The real thing, the thing that matters, is the light that comes through the windows. And you can't prove light. You can only stand in it and let it change you. And then try, with whatever poor words you have, to tell someone else where you stood. And yet, there's still one more question left hanging in the air, quiet but persistent. Third exploration. What did the smartest theologian in history refuse to explain, even when pressed? The silence of Thomas Aquinas in those final months is one of the most profound mysteries in intellectual history. Here was a man who had explained everything: the nature of angels, the mechanics of virtue, the relationship between free will and divine providence, the precise way that bread becomes body in the Eucharist. He'd written millions of words, and then, suddenly, nothing. His secretary, his friend Reginald, was desperate. The summa wasn't finished. There were questions left unanswered, sections left incomplete. The work of a lifetime just stopped. Reginald begged him, pleaded with him. Surely whatever Thomas had experienced, whatever had happened in that chapel, he could at least finish what he'd started. He could at least tell them what he'd seen. But Aquinas refused, not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly, firmly, the way you refuse to describe a dream that's already fading, knowing that words will only cheapen it. "I cannot," he said. Everything I have written seems to me like straw compared to what I have seen. What had he seen? Nobody knows. He never said. And that refusal, that sacred, stubborn silence, might be the most important thing he ever taught. Because here's what we forget. In our age of constant explanation, constant content, constant analysis of every experience before the experience has even finished happening, some things are diminished by being spoken. Some truths are so large, so immediate, so completely outside the realm of conceptual thought, that trying to capture them in language is like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. Aquinas understood something we've mostly forgotten. He understood that there's a hierarchy to knowing. At the bottom, there's knowledge about things, facts, information, secondhand reports. A step up, there's knowledge of things, direct experience, encounter, the knowing that comes from presence. And at the very top, there's a kind of knowing that dissolves the distinction between knower and known altogether. Where you don't know truth, you become it. You stand inside it. You're transformed by it. And that kind of knowing, that can't be transferred, can't be taught, can't be written down, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how precise your language. It can only be pointed to. And even then, only barely. I think about this whenever I'm tempted to over-explain something, to take apart a moment of beauty or mystery or grace, and lay out all the pieces as if understanding it intellectually is the same as experiencing it. It's not. And somewhere deep down, we all know it's not. You can read 1,000 books about love and still not know what it feels like when someone looks at you and sees you, really sees you, for the first time. You can study the neuroscience of grief and still be completely unprepared for the way it hollows you out, makes you new. You can memorize every theory of aesthetics and still be struck dumb by a painting, a sunset, a line of poetry that reaches inside you and rearranges something fundamental. Aquinas spent his whole life in the realm of explanation. He was brilliant at it, maybe the best ever, but in the end, he was given something that couldn't be explained. And rather than try to force it into words, rather than reduce it, domesticate it, make it safe and comprehensible, he chose silence. That takes a different kind of courage. The courage to let mystery be mysterious, to let the sacred remain sacred, to resist the urge to turn every profound experience into content, into a lesson, into something useful that can be packaged and passed along. There's a kind of violence in over-explanation, a kind of colonization of experience. We take something vast and alive and we pin it down, label it, explain it, until it stops moving, until it's dead. And then we wonder why the words feel empty, why the explanation, no matter how accurate, doesn't capture what we felt. Aquinas refused to do that. He refused to kill the thing that had brought him to life. And in that refusal, there's a teaching more powerful than anything he wrote. The teaching is this: not everything needs to be said. Not everything should be said. Some experiences are meant to be carried in silence, the way you carry a candle through the dark, shielding the flame with your hand. His last months were spent in that silence. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of having moved beyond saying. He'd spent his life building bridges between earth and heaven out of words. And then he discovered that you don't need a bridge when you're already standing on both sides at once. What did he see? What did he experience that made everything else seem like straw? We don't know. We'll never know. And that's exactly as it should be. Because the moment he tried to tell us, it would have become something smaller. something contained, something we could file away and think we understood. Instead, his silence invites us into our own encounter, our own experience of whatever it is that's too big for words. It says, there's something beyond all this thinking, all this explaining, all this trying to get it right. And when you find it, or when it finds you, you'll know. Not because someone told you, not because you read about it, but because you'll feel the words fall away. You'll feel the straw for what it is. And in that moment, you won't need to explain it either. You'll just rest in it, the way Aquinas rested, the way the tired rest, the way all of us eventually must learn to rest, in the presence of what cannot be said, in the silence that holds everything, in the peace that comes when you finally stop trying to understand and just let yourself be understood by something vast and patient and closer than your own breath. Fourth exploration. Why do brilliant men sometimes choose silence over the one answer everyone wants to hear? There's a weight that comes with understanding, not the light, easy kind of knowing, the kind you pick up from books or conversations, the kind that makes you feel clever at dinner parties. No, this is different. This is the kind of understanding that arrives uninvited in the middle of the night and changes the architecture of your inner world. The kind that makes you realize that some of the questions you've been asking your whole life were the wrong questions entirely. Thomas Aquinas carried that weight for years before it finally broke him open. Picture him there, in his study at the monastery of San Domenico. It's late. It's always late when these moments come. The candle on his desk has burned down to a stub, casting long shadows across pages covered in his careful handwriting. Outside, the Italian countryside is silent, except for the occasional cry of a night bird. Inside, there's only the scratch of his pen, the creak of his chair when he shifts his considerable weight, the whisper of parchment as he turns another page. He's building something, has been building it for decades. A structure of pure thought, an architecture of logic so precise, so comprehensive, that it could contain God himself, or at least describe him, explain him, make him comprehensible to the rational mind. The Summa Theologica, his masterwork, thousands upon thousands of words, each one chosen with the care of a jeweler setting stones. Questions posed and answered, objections raised and refuted. Layer upon layer of careful reasoning, like a cathedral built from nothing but human thought. But here's what haunts me about his story, what keeps circling back in my mind like a moth around that flickering candle. All that brilliance, all that effort, all those years of trying to capture infinity in language. And then, one day, he just stopped, put down his pen, refused to write another word. They asked him why. Of course they did. His brothers in the order, his students, his friends. They all wanted to know. What happened? What changed? Please, just tell us. Just explain. And he wouldn't, or couldn't, or, and this is what I think is true, he'd finally learned that some things lose their truth the moment you try to speak them. I cannot write anymore, he told them. That's all. Just those few words, spoken quietly, with the finality of a door closing. And when they pressed him, when they begged him to at least finish what he'd started, he said only this: everything I have written seems to me like straw. Straw. Not wrong exactly, not false, just insufficient, thin, empty. Like trying to describe the ocean to someone who's never seen water, using only words you learned in a desert. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when he realizes his life's work has been, in some fundamental way, beside the point. Not useless. Aquinas never said his writings were useless, but incomplete in a way that can't be fixed by adding more words. Incomplete in the way that a map is incomplete compared to the actual journey. In the way that a recipe is incomplete compared to the taste of the meal. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to build a ladder to God out of logic. Rung by careful rung, argument by argument. And then, in a moment, nobody knows exactly when or how, though some say it happened during Mass, others say in a dream. He was simply there. Not at the top of the ladder, but standing in the presence he'd been trying to reach. And when he looked back at the ladder, at all those careful rungs he'd constructed with such precision and pride, they looked like straw. I think about this whenever I'm tempted to explain too much, whenever I feel the urge to take something beautiful or mysterious or sacred and dissect it, lay it out, make it comprehensible. There's a violence in that urge, subtle but real, a kind of control, as if by explaining something we can master it, possess it, make it safe. But some truths don't want to be safe. Some experiences resist explanation the way fire resists being held. You can describe fire, its chemistry, its physics, the way it transforms fuel into heat and light. But that description, no matter how accurate, will never burn you, will never warm you, will never cast shadows that dance on the walls of your cave. Aquinas understood this, finally. He'd been describing fire his whole life, with more precision and insight than perhaps anyone before or since. But then he touched it, felt it, stood in it. And after that, how could he go back to the descriptions? How could he pretend they were adequate? So he chose silence. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of having moved beyond saying. The silence of a man who's been talking his whole life and has finally learned to listen. And here's what that silence teaches us, if we're willing to hear it. That brilliance isn't always about having the answer. Sometimes it's about recognizing when the question itself needs to dissolve, when the seeking needs to stop so the finding can happen, when the mind needs to rest so something deeper, something that's been there all along, patient and waiting, can finally speak. The answer everyone wanted from Aquinas was this: tell us what you experienced. Explain the unexplainable. Give us the secret, the formula, the final truth that will make everything make sense. And his silence said, there is no formula. There's only presence. There's only the direct encounter that changes everything and can't be transferred like information from one mind to another. I can't give you what I found, because it's not a thing to be given. It's a place you have to arrive at yourself, a recognition, a remembering. His silence was an act of love, really, because the easy thing, the expected thing, would have been to try anyway, to write something, to give them words, even knowing the words would be inadequate, to build them a new ladder, even knowing it would also be made of straw. But he refused. He honored what he'd experienced by not reducing it. He protected the mystery by letting it remain mysterious. He trusted that his silence might do more than his words ever could, might create a space, a question, an emptiness that could draw others toward their own encounter, rather than settling for his description of his. In the end, the brilliant man chose silence because he'd learned what all the deepest wisdom traditions know, that the most profound truths aren't conclusions you arrive at through reasoning. They're recognitions that arrive through you, when the reasoning finally stops, when the mind grows quiet, when you stop trying to climb the ladder and realize you were never separate from what you were trying to reach. The candle burns down, the night deepens, the pages sit there, unfinished, and will remain unfinished forever. And in that incompletion, there's a strange perfection, a teaching that can only be transmitted through absence, through the space where words should be but aren't, through the silence of a man who finally learned that the deepest answer isn't something you speak, it's something you become. But there's another mystery here, one that lives in the years before the silence. Fifth exploration. What does a man who's memorized scripture still pray for in the dark? The monastery at night is a particular kind of darkness. Not the darkness of wilderness or open sea, where the sky stretches vast and star-filled above you. This is an enclosed darkness, a human darkness. Stone walls and narrow corridors. The smell of old incense and older prayers. The weight of centuries of devotion pressing down like a physical thing. Thomas Aquinas knew this darkness intimately. Every night, after the others had gone to their cells, after the last prayers had been sung and the last candles extinguished, he would remain. Kneeling there on the cold floor of the chapel, his large frame bent in a posture of supplication that must have been painful to maintain for hours, which he did. Hours, sometimes until dawn. What was he doing there? What was he asking for? Here was a man who had, quite literally, memorized scripture, who could quote Augustine and Aristotle from memory, who understood theology so deeply that popes consulted him, universities competed for him, students traveled across Europe just to hear him lecture. He knew every argument for God's existence. He'd cataloged every virtue, analyzed every sin, mapped the entire architecture of divine grace with a precision that still astounds. And yet, there he was, night after night, alone in the dark, praying. Not the rote prayers of obligation, though he said those too, of course, but something else, something rawer, more desperate. The kind of prayer that rises from a place beneath language, beneath theology, beneath all the careful constructions of thought. What does a man pray for when he already knows all the answers? When he's spent his days teaching others about God with absolute confidence and clarity? When he can prove, logically and irrefutably, that God exists, that God is good, that God's providence governs all things? I think he was praying for what knowledge can never give you, presence. Because you can know about someone without knowing them. You can study them, understand their patterns, predict their behavior, explain their nature, and still be strangers, still be separated by a gap that no amount of information can bridge. Aquinas spent his days building bridges out of logic. But in the night, in the darkness of that chapel, I think he felt the gap more acutely than anyone. The distance between the God he could describe and the God he longed to encounter. The difference between knowing that God is love and feeling yourself loved. Between proving divine providence and trusting it with your actual life, your actual fears, your actual loneliness. There's a tradition in the monastery where he lived, probably not historically accurate, but true in the way legends are true, that once, late at night, another brother came looking for him and found him levitating in prayer, several feet off the ground, weeping. When Thomas came back to himself and realized he'd been seen, he made the brother swear never to tell anyone while he was alive. Whether that happened or not doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it could have happened. that there was something in Thomas Aquinas, in this mountain of a man, this intellectual giant, this master of rational thought, that was capable of being so overcome with longing that his body would forget itself, that his careful control would shatter, that he would weep. What do you weep for when you already have all the answers? You weep for the question beneath the questions, the hunger that knowledge can sharpen but never satisfy, the ache of separation from something that should never have been separate in the first place. I think about this on the nights when I can't sleep, when my mind is full of things I know but don't feel, when I understand, intellectually, that everything is connected, that love underlies reality, that there's a pattern and purpose to it all, but I can't sense it, can't touch it. When the knowledge sits in my head like facts in a textbook, true but distant, cold but correct. Those are the nights when I understand why Aquinas prayed in the dark, because darkness strips away everything but need, everything but longing. In the daylight, you can perform your knowledge, wear it like armor, use it to build and teach and prove. But in the dark, alone, with no one watching, no one to impress, no questions to answer, what remains? The prayer beneath the prayers, the cry beneath the theology, the simple, wordless reaching towards something that all your brilliance has only made you more aware is missing. He would rest his forehead against the cold stone. I imagine it this way, though I don't know it for certain. And the stone would not answer. The darkness would not part. The silence would remain silence. And he would stay there anyway, hour after hour. Not because he was performing some kind of spiritual exercise, not because this was what monks were supposed to do, but because he had nowhere else to go with this longing, this gap, this beautiful, terrible awareness that everything he knew was true, and yet somehow not enough. Scripture speaks of a peace that passes understanding. But what about the understanding that can't find peace? What about knowing all the right answers and still feeling lost? What about being able to prove God's existence and still, in some deep part of yourself, feeling alone in the universe? That's what I think he carried to the chapel each night. Not doubt, exactly. His faith was real. His belief was genuine. But belief and encounter are different countries, and you can live your whole life on the border between them, seeing one from the other, describing one to the other, without ever making the crossing. The prayers he prayed in the dark weren't in his books, couldn't be, because they weren't the prayers of a teacher, but of a student. Not the prayers of someone who had figured it out, but of someone who had figured out how much there was to figure out, and how inadequate figuring out would always be. What does a man who's memorized Scripture still pray for in the dark? He prays for the Scripture to become flesh, for the Word to become presence, for the God he can describe with such precision to become the God he can feel holding him. He prays for the latter to disappear, and the distance to close. He prays for the end of separation. He prays, I think, to stop praying, to arrive, to rest. Not in knowledge, but in being known. Not in understanding, but in being understood. Not in having all the answers, but in becoming himself. An answer to a question God is asking. And sometimes, on certain nights, in that particular darkness, with his face pressed against stone worn smooth by centuries of similar prayers, maybe the gap would narrow, just for a moment, just enough to feel the warmth of what waited on the other side. Not an answer, not an explanation, just presence, just the faintest whisper of the thing itself, and then it would fade, as it always faded, and he would rise, stiff and cold and still separate, and walk back to his cell, and in the morning he would wake and teach and write and explain and prove. But the night would come again, and he would return to the chapel and pray once more for what he already knew, but needed desperately to feel, for the Word to become flesh, for the distance to close, for the coming home that all his brilliant wandering had only made him more homesick for. And yet, there remains one final question, older than his books, deeper than his prayers. Sixth exploration. Can you build a heaven inside your mind and still die? Terrified of the real one. There's a detail about Thomas Aquinas' death that most people don't know, or if they know it, they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't fit the story we want to tell about him, the story of the serene sage, the man who'd figured it all out, who approached death with philosophical calm and theological certainty. The detail is this: he was afraid. Not at the very end, perhaps, but in those final months, as he traveled toward the Council of Lyon where the Pope had summoned him, as his health deteriorated, and he must have known the end was approaching. There's evidence in the accounts of those who were with him that he was wrestling with something, a darkness that wasn't just physical illness, a fear that all his reasoning couldn't dispel. How is that possible? How can a man who spent his entire life explaining the afterlife, who wrote with absolute confidence about the fate of souls, who constructed elaborate logical proofs of heaven's existence and heaven's nature, how can that man be afraid to actually go there? It's the difference between building a house and living in one, between drawing a map and taking the journey, between knowing the theory of flight and stepping off the cliff. Aquinas had constructed heaven in his mind with extraordinary precision. He knew, or thought he knew, exactly how it worked. The beatific vision, the communion of saints, the degrees of glory, the eternal contemplation of the divine essence. He could explain it all, answer any question, resolve any apparent contradiction. But explain something to yourself long enough, and you risk creating a substitute for the real thing, a simulation, a beautiful, intricate, entirely mental construct that keeps you safe from having to actually encounter what you're describing. I think about this whenever I catch myself doing the same thing, building elaborate philosophies about acceptance, about letting go, about trusting the process. And then, when life actually asks me to accept something, to let go of something, to trust something I can't control, I freeze. I realize that all my beautiful theories about surrender were just ways of avoiding the actual experience of surrendering. That my mental heaven was a shelter from the terrifying reality of heaven itself. Because here's what Aquinas understood better than most. The real heaven, the actual encounter with the divine, would mean the complete dissolution of the self he'd spent his entire life building. The intellectual self. The self that understood things. The self that could explain and categorize and make sense of reality. That self would have to die, would have to be burned away like fog in sunlight. And no matter how much you intellectually believe that what remains will be better, purer, more real, the dying part is still dying. The burning part still burns. He'd written about this, of course. He'd explained it beautifully. The soul must be purged of all attachment to created things before it can fully receive the divine. The self must be emptied so it can be filled. Death is not the end, but a transformation, a becoming. Beautiful words, true words even, but words nonetheless. And when you're actually standing at that threshold, when you can feel the heat of that purifying fire, when the dissolution you've been describing in the abstract is suddenly concrete and immediate and unavoidable, the body remembers that it doesn't want to end. The ego remembers that it doesn't want to dissolve. The mind that built the beautiful theory of heaven suddenly doesn't want to undergo the reality. There are accounts that in his final days, he asked for the Song of Songs to be read to him. Over and over. That ancient, sensual, mysterious text about the soul's longing for God, about seeking and not finding, about the beloved who appears and disappears, about a love that's beyond reason and beyond comfort. Why that text? Why not his own Summa? Why not the careful, logical expositions he devoted his life to creating? Maybe because, in the face of actual death, in the presence of the real threshold, logic wasn't what he needed. Proof wasn't what he needed. He needed the language of longing, of mystery, of a love that doesn't make sense, but might, just might, be strong enough to carry him through the terrifying transition from the heaven he'd built to the heaven that actually is. I think there's a particular kind of courage required to die when you've spent your life being certain. Because certainty is a kind of defense, a way of keeping reality at arm's length, of maintaining control. And death is the ultimate loss of control, the ultimate surrender to something you cannot manage or explain or master. The heaven in his mind was perfect because it was his. He'd constructed it. He understood it. He could walk through it like a familiar house, knowing where every door led, what every room contained. But the real heaven? That was someone else's house, God's house. And stepping into it meant surrendering not just his body but his mind, his understanding, his careful constructions. Everything he'd built would have to be left at the door. No wonder he was afraid. But here's what moves me most about this story. He went anyway. Afraid or not, certain or not, he made the journey. He left the monastery where he'd done his life's work. He set out on the road toward Lyon. And when his body gave out at a monastery along the way, when death finally came for him there, in a room that wasn't his own, in a place he'd never been before, he met it. Not with the philosophical calm we might have expected, not with quotations from his own work or logical proofs that death was nothing to fear. He met it as a human being meets the unknown, with trembling perhaps, with doubt maybe, but also with a kind of naked trust that all his certainty had never required of him. He'd built a heaven inside his mind, and it had been beautiful. But in the end, he had to let it burn, had to release his grip on the map and take the actual journey, had to stop being the expert on heaven and become, simply, a soul approaching heaven's gate. And that's the final teaching, I think, the one that can't be written in any book. That courage isn't the absence of fear, that faith isn't the same as certainty, that knowing about something, even knowing everything about something, is no protection against the terror and wonder of actually experiencing it. The heaven we build in our minds might help us, might prepare us in some way. But it's not the destination, it's just scaffolding. And when the real building is ready, the scaffolding has to come down. Thomas Aquinas spent his life as the greatest scaffolding builder in Christian history. And then, at the end, he had to do what we all must do. He had to let it fall away, had to trust that beneath the structures he'd built, there was something real, something that would hold him, something vast and ancient and utterly beyond his ability to comprehend, but that comprehended him completely. The last word attributed to him, spoken barely above a whisper in that unfamiliar room, was simply, "I receive thee." Not I understand thee, not I have proven thee. Just, I receive. The work of a lifetime of reasoning, resolved at last into a single act of reception, of opening, of allowing himself to be known rather than being the one who knows. And in that final surrender, maybe he found what all his brilliant construction had been pointing toward all along. Not a heaven he could build, or describe, or prove, but a heaven that could finally hold him in the dark, in the mystery, in the end of all his explaining. Seventh exploration. What does it mean to hold the entire universe in your hand and still ask why? There's a story they don't tell you about Thomas Aquinas, not in the textbooks, not in the portraits where he stands robed and solemn, a saint frozen in oil and certainty. The story they leave out is this: he was a man who believed you could take God apart like a clock, understand every gear, every silent turning, and still be left with the question that has no answer. Picture him for a moment, not as marble, not as myth. Picture him in a stone room in Paris, winter seeping through the walls, a single candle burning low. His hand moves across parchment, ink pooling in the grooves of Latin script. He writes the same sentence 3 different ways, crosses it out, begins again. He is trying to prove that God exists, not because he doubts, but because he believes the mind is holy too. That reason is a kind of prayer. And here's the thing about Thomas. He didn't just believe in God. He believed in the architecture of belief itself. He thought you could walk through the corridors of logic and arrive, breathless, at the throne room of the Almighty. 5 proofs, he offered. 5 roads that all led to the same place: motion, causation, contingency, perfection, design. Each one a ladder, each one a way to climb from the world you can touch to the world that touches you. But what happens when you reach the top of the ladder and find only more sky? Thomas spent his life building arguments the way some men build cathedrals, stone by stone, premise by premise. If nothing moves itself, then something must be the first mover. If nothing causes itself, then something must be the first cause. He was relentless, precise. He mapped the invisible with the tools of the visible, and for a long time, it seemed to work. It seemed like the universe could be held, examined, understood. And yet, there's a moment in every thinker's life when the tools fail, when the mind, sharp as it is, runs up against something it cannot cut. Thomas knew this. He wrote thousands of pages, answered every objection, anticipated every doubt. But near the end of his life, something happened. He stopped writing, mid-sentence, mid-thought. He said the words that have haunted scholars ever since. All that I have written seems like straw to me. Straw. Not wrong, not false, just insufficient. Like trying to describe the ocean with a thimble of water. What does it mean to hold the entire universe in your hand and still ask why? It means that knowing and understanding are not the same country. It means you can trace every chain of cause and effect back to the beginning, and still not know why there is a beginning at all. It means that even the smartest man in the room can build a perfect argument for God, and still feel, in the quiet moments, the enormous silence that follows every proof. Thomas believed in a God who was pure act, no potential left unrealized, a being so complete that existence itself flowed from him like light from a flame. And that's beautiful. That's a thought you can almost rest in. But here's the edge of it. If God is the answer to every question, then what do you do with the questions that remain even after you've found God? Thomas didn't stop believing, but he stopped explaining. And maybe that's the real teaching. Maybe the deepest truth isn't something you can write down. Maybe it's something that happens to you when you've exhausted every argument and you're left alone in the dark with the fact of your own existence. This strange, unexplained gift of being here at all. The medievals had a phrase for it: the mystery of being. Not a puzzle to solve, but a presence to stand inside. You don't hold the universe in your hand. You realize quietly that you are being held, that the question isn't why does anything exist, but why do I get to be part of it? And Thomas, for all his brilliance, for all his syllogisms and proofs, knew this. He knew that at the end of reason, you don't find an answer. You find an invitation to stop speaking, to stop grasping, to let the mind finally rest in the silence that was there all along, beneath every word, holding every thought like water holds a stone. The candle burns lower. The page remains unfinished. And somewhere in that stone room in Paris, a man who knew too much learned at last to live with not knowing. Eighth exploration. Can a question be more sacred than the answer it seeks? Here's what they won't tell you about medieval theology. It wasn't built on certainty. It was built on ache, on the slow, grinding realization that the more you know, the more you see the shape of what you'll never know. Thomas Aquinas spent his entire life asking questions, not the easy kind, the kind that crack open the floor beneath you and show you just how far down it goes. He was 14 when he first encountered Aristotle. Not the watered-down version, the real thing, newly translated from Arabic, smuggled into Europe like contraband. And it was contraband in a way, because Aristotle didn't start with God. He started with the world, with motion and matter, and the stubborn fact of things changing. He asked, what makes a thing what it is? Why does an acorn become an oak and not a sparrow? These weren't supposed to be holy questions, but Thomas saw something in them. He saw that the world itself was a kind of scripture, that you could read the mind of God in the way water flows downhill, in the way a flame rises, in the way every living thing hungers toward its own completion. So he asked, and asked, and asked, can something come from nothing? If God knows the future, are we free? What does it mean to exist? That last one, that's the question that haunted him. Not whether God exists, but what existence even is. What it means for anything to be. And he came up with an answer so strange, so precise, that it still makes philosophers dizzy. He said, existence isn't a thing, it's an act. It's not something you have. It's something that happens to you. You are not a container holding existence. You are existence, unfolding, moment by moment, held in place by something outside yourself. And if you pull that thread far enough, you arrive at God, not as a being among beings, but as being itself, the act of existence with no conditions, no dependencies, no borrowed light. God for Thomas was the reason anything could be at all. Not a clockmaker who wound things up and walked away, but the continuous, relentless presence that keeps the universe from collapsing back into nothing. It's a dizzying thought. And Thomas knew it. He knew that every answer opened 10 new questions, that every proof led to a deeper mystery. But he didn't stop. He kept asking, because for him, the questions weren't obstacles to faith. They were the shape of faith itself. Think about that. In a world that wanted easy certainty, that wanted God delivered in neat packages, Thomas offered something harder. The idea that doubt could be holy, that wonder could be worship. that asking why wasn't a failure of belief, but the deepest kind of belief there is. He wrote like a man possessed. Thousands of pages, question after question after question, not because he didn't have answers, but because he understood that an answer without a question is just noise. That truth isn't a destination, it's a direction, a way of walking. And here's the thing they don't teach you in philosophy class. Thomas never confused the question with the questioner. He knew that behind every intellectual puzzle was a human being standing in the dark, trying to make sense of what it means to live and die and love and lose. He wrote for them, for the ones who couldn't stop wondering, for the ones who felt, somewhere deep, that the questions mattered more than comfort ever could. Because a question, when you hold it right, becomes a kind of prayer. It becomes the mind reaching past itself, touching the edge of something it can't contain. And maybe that's what Thomas understood better than anyone. That God isn't threatened by our questions. That the act of asking is the relationship. That every why is a form of longing, and longing is just another word for love. The stone room again, the candle, the unfinished page. But this time, imagine him not frustrated. Imagine him almost smiling, because he's realized something, that the question itself, the ache of not knowing, the hunger to understand, that's the thing that makes us most like God. Not the answers, the questions, the sacred, endless questions that keep us awake and alive and reaching towards something we can't quite name. And in the end, maybe that's enough. Maybe the question is the answer. Maybe the seeking is the finding. And maybe, just maybe, the only proof we need is the fact that we can't stop asking. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. Ninth exploration. What if the truest thing you know is the one thing you can never explain? There's a moment in Thomas Aquinas' life that hardly anyone talks about. It happened in December of 1273, during Mass in a small chapel in Naples. He was celebrating the Eucharist, the ritual he'd performed 1,000 times, the one that represented everything he'd spent his life trying to explain. Bread, wine, substance, accident, transubstantiation. He'd written whole volumes on it, built philosophical scaffolding so intricate, so precise, that scholars still study it today. And then, in the middle of it, something happened. He never said what. He stopped speaking about it, stopped writing entirely. When his secretary Reginald begged him to finish the Summa Theologica, his life's work still incomplete, Thomas looked at him and said, "I cannot. Everything I have written seems like straw compared to what I have seen." What did he see? We don't know. But here's what we do know. Thomas Aquinas, the man who believed you could explain anything, who spent decades translating mystery into logic, suddenly found himself on the other side of language, in a place where words didn't reach, where all his carefully constructed arguments felt like shadows of something too bright, too real to capture. And he didn't try. That's the astonishing part. He didn't scramble to describe it, didn't write a new treatise on mystical experience. He just stopped and lived the last months of his life in silence, carrying something he couldn't share. What if the truest thing you know is the one thing you can never explain? Think about that. Not as a failure, but as a recognition that there are kinds of knowing that don't fit in sentences, that can't be argued or proven or handed from one mind to another like a coin. Some things you have to live into. Some truths you carry alone. Thomas spent his whole life in the realm of intellect. He believed in it, trusted it. He thought that reason was a bridge to God, that if you could just arrange the premises correctly, if you could just follow the logic far enough, you'd arrive at something solid, something you could stand on. And in a way, he was right. His arguments are beautiful, elegant. They do something to you when you read them. They show you that the world is not chaos, that there's an order, a coherence, a pattern woven so deep that even suffering and confusion can't unravel it. But there's a difference between knowing about something and knowing it, between understanding the mechanics of love and falling so deeply into it that you forget your own name. Thomas, for all his brilliance, knew this. He wrote about it, actually. He said there are two kinds of knowledge: scientia, the knowledge of the mind, and sapientia, the knowledge of the heart. Wisdom, the kind that tastes like honey, the kind that changes you. And maybe that's what happened in that chapel. Maybe he tasted it. Maybe, for one unguarded moment, the distance between him and God collapsed. Not as a concept, not as a conclusion, but as a presence, so immediate, so overwhelming, that every word he'd ever written felt like a child's drawing of the sun. And here's the thing. He didn't lose his faith. He didn't recant. He didn't say, "I was wrong." He said, "I was incomplete." There's a difference. He wasn't abandoning reason. He was admitting that reason has a horizon, that beyond a certain point, the mind gives way to something else. Not to irrationality, but to a deeper kind of knowing that doesn't need to explain itself. You've felt this, haven't you? Maybe not in a chapel. Maybe in a moment when you held your child for the first time, or watched someone you love sleep, or stood under a sky so full of stars that you felt small and infinite at the same time. There are moments when the world stops being a problem to solve and becomes a gift you didn't ask for. When the only response is silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because anything you say would be less than the moment itself. Thomas lived the rest of his life in that silence. Not a bitter silence, not a defeated one, a full silence, the kind that holds more than words ever could. And maybe that's the final teaching, that the goal isn't to explain everything. It's to become someone who can stand in the presence of what can't be explained and not turn away. To let the mystery be mysterious. To let the truth remain true even when you can't wrap it in language and hand it to someone else. The stone room is empty now. The candle has burned down. The page, still unfinished, lies on the desk. But somewhere in the space between the words he wrote and the silence he chose, there's a man who found what he was looking for. Not an answer, but a presence. Not certainty, but something better. Something real. And if you listen carefully, in the quiet just before sleep, you can almost hear it. The truth that doesn't need to be spoken. The knowing that lives beneath all knowing. The silence that isn't empty, but full. So full it spills over into everything. Holding you. Holding the world. Holding even the questions that will never be answered. Holding you still. 10th, exploration. Is there a loneliness that comes from understanding God better than most men ever will? There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside brilliant men. Not the silence of not knowing, but the silence that comes after you've spent 40 years explaining the divine to people who nod, but never quite reach the same shore you're standing on. Thomas Aquinas knew that silence. He lived inside it like a house he'd built himself. Room by room, argument by argument, until one December morning in 1273, when he simply stopped building. Picture him there in Naples, a heavy man in his late 40s, bent over manuscripts that had consumed decades of his life. The Summa Theologica sprawled before him like a city of thought, each question a street, each answer a dwelling place. He'd been constructing a complete architecture of existence itself, proving God's nature through reason the way a mason proves a wall will stand, through careful placement of stone. But on that morning, something happened during Mass, something he never fully explained. And afterward, when his secretary urged him to continue writing, Thomas said only, "I cannot. Everything I have written seems like straw to me." Straw. Not wrong necessarily, just insufficient, thin, brittle, the kind of thing that looks solid until you've seen what it's meant to carry. Imagine spending your entire life as the man everyone comes to with their deepest questions, the one who can untangle any theological knot, who can take the most abstract concept and make it walk and breathe in language. You become a kind of translator between the infinite and the everyday, between the mind of God and the confusion of men trying to live decent lives. And people are grateful. They copy your words, debate your arguments, build universities around your thinking. But here's what nobody tells you about being that person. You end up in a strange country with no passport back. You've climbed so high up the mountain of understanding that the air is different. And when you come back down to explain what you've seen, even your best words feel like trying to describe color to someone who's only ever known darkness and light. Thomas had a brother named Reginald, who walked beside him through those final months. Reginald watched him grow quieter, more distant, like a man listening to music no one else could hear. He'd ask Thomas to explain, to return to the work, to finish what he'd started. But Thomas would just shake his head. How do you tell someone that you've glimpsed something that makes all your previous glimpses look like shadows? How do you say that the thing you've been describing for 40 years is so much vaster, so much stranger, so much more immediate than any description could hold? There's a particular weight that settles on a man when he realizes his life's work, no matter how magnificent, is only ever going to be a finger pointing at the moon. Not the moon itself. Never the moon itself. Think about the people who came to Thomas over those decades. Confused priests, struggling students, men wrestling with doubt in the hours before dawn. They'd arrive at his door with questions that felt like life and death to them. Does God know the future? Can faith and reason coexist? What happens to the soul between death and judgment? And Thomas would welcome them. He'd sit with their confusion. He'd build them bridges out of logic and scripture, beautiful spans of thought that could carry them from not knowing to something like peace. But who did Thomas go to with his own confusion? When the man who explains God to everyone else lies awake, wondering if any explanation can ever be enough, where does he rest his questions? That's the loneliness I'm talking about. Not the loneliness of being misunderstood, but the loneliness of being understood as well as anyone can understand you, and knowing that still leaves an unbridgeable gap. It's the loneliness of the last guard in the watchtower, the one who stays awake while everyone else sleeps soundly because of the watch he keeps. In Thomas's writings, there's this concept he kept returning to, the idea that we can know that God exists through reason, but we can never fully know what God is. We can approach the mystery through negation, saying what God is not limited, not changeable, not bound by time. But the positive knowledge, the direct encounter, that remains always just beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated argument. He knew this intellectually for years, taught it, defended it in debates. But maybe that morning in Naples, he didn't just know it, he felt it. Maybe the difference between understanding something and experiencing it collapsed. And suddenly all those carefully constructed proofs felt like trying to capture the ocean in a series of very detailed buckets. The last months of his life, Thomas traveled slowly toward a church council he'd never reach. He died in a monastery along the way, still relatively young, worn out perhaps by the weight of trying to hold infinity in finite words. The monks there said he seemed at peace, but also somehow absent, like most of him had already gone ahead to whatever country he'd glimpsed that December morning. What stays with me is this. A man spends his entire life becoming the greatest explainer of divine things his era has ever known. And in the end, he chooses silence. Not because he stopped believing, not because he was broken by doubt, but because he'd finally touched something that explanation couldn't hold. And maybe in that silence, he found a kind of communion that all his brilliant words had been circling around, but never quite landing on. There's something oddly comforting in that. The idea that even perfect understanding leaves room for mystery. That even the man who could out-argue anyone still ended up in a place beyond argument. That intelligence, no matter how vast, eventually kneels before something larger than itself. But still, imagine being the one who stands in that place, knowing what you know, having seen what you've seen, and then having to walk among people who want you to keep explaining, keep building, keep translating the infinite into the manageable. That's not just loneliness. That's a kind of exile from your own revelation. Thomas once wrote that the ultimate happiness of man is to know God. But he lived long enough to discover that even in knowing, there remains an unknowing. Even in seeing, there persists a darkness. And perhaps that darkness isn't absence. Perhaps it's just the shadow cast by a light too bright to look at directly, too vast to be contained in even the most magnificent architecture of human thought. Some kinds of understanding isolate you, not because they're wrong, but because they're more true than most people ever need to bear. But before we leave this thought behind, there's another weight Thomas carried, something even heavier than the loneliness of understanding.